There is a lot of there's a lot of noise. Order. There's a lot of noise, and it's also with a lot of people moving into the gallery. I'd ask that we give the speakers some respect. Maiteri, Turei.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to address the Prime Minister's statement and commend the comments of my Green colleagues who have spoken earlier in this debate and my colleague Rahul Katane, whose contribution I heard, I think, last night about the social inequity issues that this country faces for Māori in particular, and the failure of this government to address those in any form. And I would like to pick up on some of the themes of her, of what she was saying from a Green Party point of view. Sir, the Prime Minister said in his speech that he was concerned, he said, I worry about the emergence of an underclass in Aotearoa, or he said New Zealand, and New Zealand. And, well, how fantastic that the Prime Minister would worry about such a thing. But in fact, he must obviously be blind to the reality of hundreds of thousands of New Zealand families who already are part of an underclass in this country. And not only has the Prime Minister displayed his blindness and his failure to understand what it means to be a low-paid, vulnerable family in this country, but everything he said yesterday in his statement, everything he said, every plan he has for this country will further create that underclass, will add more and more New Zealanders to that underclass, more and more New Zealand children to that underclass. And I want to just discuss some of those plans to create and increase this underclass in Aotearoa. We have some 200,000 children living in poverty in this country. Many of them are the children of beneficiaries, identified as the children most likely to be living in serious and significant hardship, because the social security system on which these children and their families rely is simply too poor to support their needs. Families cannot live on a benefit. Now, I myself have had to live on a benefit, both on the unemployment benefit and on the domestic purposes benefit. And I know what it is like for those families to have to provide for their kids and find a way to get themselves out of that situation. The beneficiaries and the people I've known who have been on benefits over many years, people I've worked with who have been on benefits, I know, are fighting every day just for survival and fighting every day to find a way out. And what they need is support from the state, not cutting services like the training incentive allowance, which of course makes it impossible extremely difficult, if not impossible, for most people on the domestic purposes benefit to get a university degree, when we know that a person with a university degree will earn a higher income than with any other kind of tertiary education qualification. And yet this government has shut out those people, domestic purposes beneficiaries, solo parents who are struggling to find a way to get themselves out of that situation, from being able to get the kind of degree that will enable them to earn a high income. Because what is the response of this government to the increasing numbers of unemployed and beneficiaries? It is to blame and attack those families, to blame and attack the children of the poorest families. The benefit reforms proposed or highlighted by the Prime Minister in his statement simply entrench the inequality that this country faces, simply entrench the poverty gap between the rich and the poor, by forcing solo parents, ordinary Kiwi mums and dads who for whatever reason find themselves in need of social support, forcing them into a job market that doesn't exist, that cannot cope with them, for there are not the jobs there for them to go to, will not work. It will do nothing for those families. It will severely interfere with the ability of those solo parents to properly parent their children. It will force them away from their homes and families and their kids who need them. It will impose greater costs on those families. Looking for work alone costs money. It costs money in childcare, it costs money in transport, a whole range of areas that obviously John Key has no concept about, doesn't understand, has never understood that process. Subjecting sickness beneficiaries to constant assessment, people who are paraplegic, people with severe illnesses, people who are unable to work and therefore need the social security system to support them as it should. Being pressured by state agencies, increasing the stress, increasing the likelihood that their illnesses will exacerbate and get worse. But not only that, the Prime Minister is isolating those families and those people from the rest of the New Zealand community and the language and the abusive language that is used to describe them. Now, we've seen the abuse all over from this government last year, of course, with a continual series of attacks on beneficiaries, and we heard more of it yesterday. But, sir, there are no jobs for these people to be forced into. They simply do not exist. 40,000 extra people unemployed. There are no jobs, so why would any government with any sense of compassion choose to attack those people who have the least amount of choice, the least amount of political power? Perhaps because it benefits them in their votes. Because the process by which this government is undertaking that work is going to create even further the underclass that Mr Key says he's so worried about. We know that the government intends to persecute those New Zealand parents who are doing their very best for their families in trying personal circumstances. But what about the working poor? Because, of course, just because you have a job doesn't mean that you have enough money to survive on. And we certainly know that the minimum wage, $12 now, $12.75 an hour, if you work a 40-hour week on the minimum wage, you're earning somewhere around $400 a week. Now, families cannot survive on that kind of money. We know that 450,000 New Zealanders are earning less than $15 an hour on the minimum wage. 450,000 New Zealanders earning a miserable wage, working full-time, which cannot support their families. And sometimes you hear the rhetoric from government that, oh, well, it's, these are young people or students or part-timers. But no, these are people who do full-time jobs and have families and struggle and struggle and struggle to find the support they need to take care of their families properly. And what do? Well, they have no choice. They use working for families, for example, to try to top up their income. But if this government chose to put up the minimum wage into a rate that was able to support a family to at least $15 an hour, this country would save $1 billion in government support, social support. $1 billion of government social support would be saved if the minimum wage was raised to a reasonable level. Now, that is $1 billion that could be invested in our schools, which are desperate for funding to support the children in those schools. That's $1 billion that could be used for housing, for other forms of social support that could support both economic development, build more houses, build more state houses. It could help support the environment in a whole range of other ways. But no, this government chooses not to support the families, but to subsidise business, because that is what Working for Families does in effect. By keeping the minimum wage low and having Working for Families or some other social support behind it, what ends up happening is that this government subsidises businesses, and those families suffer as a result. So, housing, of course, was raised in the speech. There is no plan in the government's plan to increase the number of state houses. What they're talking about actually is selling off state houses. They're talking about selling off, no plans, they're going to sell off state houses in wealthier areas and buy cheap state houses in poor areas, ghettoising those vulnerable families who need a place to live. Now, because there's no plan to build any more state housing, we're going to have a continual round of families who are in the state houses, then back on the waiting list, in the state houses, back on the waiting list, being shifted around the country, no consistency, no ability for kids to stay in the schools that they've become attached to, no ability to get work or secure work because their housing is so insecure, being separated away from their families. There are still thousands of New Zealand families on the Housing Court waiting list, waiting for a state house. And those people will stay on that waiting list, going through this cycle of poverty that keeps them poor, keeps them vulnerable, keeps them out of society, keeps their kids out of school, their kids sick. And this government has no plans to fix that. They would like to keep it that way. They're not even going to fix the issues around the housing market to make sure that housing is affordable for New Zealanders, because perhaps perhaps it is in their interest and the interests of their voters to do that. It is not in the interests of the families of this country who are desperately in need of jobs, who are desperately in need of living incomes, who are desperately